G'day everyone. Welcome along. I have around about, 30 or 40 presentations in my repertoire. This one is by far the hardest one for me to deliver. And for that reason, for a long time, I avoided doing it. I wouldn't offer it to cruise ships as an option. If anyone specifically asked for it, I'd find an excuse to avoid having to do this presentation. And over a 6-year period, I probably only presented a version of this talk 5 or 6 times. But all that changed exactly 2 years ago today. As you'll hear during the presentation, at that time I made a promise to some very special people, and I fully intend to honour that promise. Now, I first heard the story of the Penlee Lifeboat tragedy when in 2017, when Lee and I first went to England for the very first time to pick up our boat, which is our home for 5 months of each year. I thought it would make a really good story, so I did the research, I made up a presentation. That version of the story only lasted for around about 20 minutes. So I combined it with 2 other stories, short stories about maritime heroes of mine that not many people know about, and I called that presentation Unknown Heroes. But every time I went to present that talk, I'd become emotional during the part about the Penlee Lifeboat. Not really sure why. It really impacts me. Certainly it's a tragic story, but there's lots of tragic stories out there. I'm not really sure why this one impacts so much. Lee and I both have different theories about it. My theory is that this isn't ancient history. This is something that's happened during our lifetime. In fact, if you work out the time difference between Australia and England, today is actually the 43rd anniversary of this event. But there's other contributing factors as well. For many, many years, right up until she passed away, my mum was a radio operator with the Australian Volunteer Coast Guard. And Lee and I are still currently serving officers with the Australian Volunteer Coast Guard. Lee is a fully qualified rescue vessel crew person. I'm a qualified rescue vessel helmsman. We're both commercially certified marine radio operators and rescue coordinators. The Australian Volunteer Coast Guard is the sister organisation of the RNLI, or the Australian equivalent of the RNLI, the Royal National Lifeboat Institute, of which the Penlee Lifeboat was a member. We're all of us, unpaid volunteers. We just do this as a service to the community. I think the American equivalent, or the closest thing in the States, is the Coast Guard equivalent, Coast Guard Auxiliary. Because of our travels, our current operational status within the Coast Guard is as roving ambassadors for the Coast Guard. Lee's theory, on the other hand, is that I'm just a big sook, and her advice is that I should toughen up, princess. It's wonderful to have the support of your wife, other people tell me. So the story starts the week before Christmas on Saturday, the 19th of December 1981, with the MV Union Star, which is just a standard coastal freighter. You've probably seen some of these as we've cruised around. There's thousands and thousands of these operating all around the world. They're the Labradors of the seas, the workhorses of the ocean. They don't go across oceans, but they work their way down the coastlines of countries, delivering produce and things to those regions. Very, very prevalent in Europe, in Asia, and down the coastlines of Africa. And the Union Star was 70 metres long, 11 metres wide. It had 2 engines powering a single propeller. And it was on its maiden voyage. It had been built in Denmark. It was on its maiden voyage to come down to Rotterdam in the Netherlands, pick up fertiliser there, and take that fertiliser to Ireland. Because back in the early 80s, with all the troubles that they had in Ireland, that's exactly what they needed more of, more fertiliser. It had a crew of 5 under the command of Captain Henry Morton, who was an experienced captain. But he made a secret, unscheduled and completely unauthorised stop on the coast of England to pick up his wife and 2 teenage stepdaughters. Those stepdaughters lived in South Africa with their father, and they were only in England for a short period of time over the Christmas holidays. And quite understandably, the family wanted to spend as much time as they could together. So now there was 8 souls on board, but later it was found out that Mrs. Morton was actually pregnant at the time. Now, their plan was to pick up that fertiliser in Rotterdam and then work their way through the English Channel and then what's referred to as around the corner into the Irish Sea. And the corner we're talking about is Land's End, which is the most southwesternly part of England. Everything north of that is the Irish Sea. This will give you a little bit better idea. This is Land's End here. All that water to the north is the Irish Sea. And you see this place here. Now, if you go to Cornwall and you ask for directions to Mousehole, they'll have no idea what you're talking about. Any Brits here? What's it called? Mousehole, yeah. These are the people that are the guardians of the English language. Well done. And to give you some idea of the scale here, from Mousehole to Newland, just to the north there, is around about 5 or 6 minutes by road. And 1 minute drive north of Mousehole is Penlee Point, where the Penlee Lifeboat was stationed. Now, Captain Morton phoned his brother late that morning and told him that everything was going well and that they were probably going to get around the corner into the Irish Sea late that afternoon or early evening. But at 6 o'clock that night, or 1800 hours, the following radio message was made.
Land's End Coast Guard, loaded. Land's End Coast Guard. Union Star, calling Land's End Coast Guard. Union Star, this is Thomas Coast Guard. Over. Yes, we're off. Approximately now 8 miles east of Wolf Rock. Engines have stopped, and we are unable to get them started at the moment.
So they're 8 miles off the coast. Both engines have stopped. They don't know why. Now, Captain Morton didn't issue a mayday, but he had contacted the Coast Guard on Channel 16, which is the international distress frequency. Under SOLAS regulations, it's monitored by all ships at sea. We're monitoring Channel 16 on the bridge as we speak right now. And the call was heard by other vessels in the area, including a salvage tug by the name of the Nord Holland. And at 18:16, the captain of the Nord Holland radioed Captain Morton once again on Channel 16, offering assistance. And then they went off to a different working frequency to discuss the terms of that assistance. Now, the assistance was offered under the terms of the Lloyd's Open Letter of Salvage, which is a standard salvage or rescue type document. But it means that instead of negotiating a set fixed fee for a tow from point A to point B, in this case from the location of the Union Star to a safe harbour, which might be £5,000, £6,000, £7,000, don't know. Instead of that, the amount of the compensation for this assistance is worked out by an independent panel based in London. And they work on a matrix of different things, including things like the value of the ship and its cargo, and the danger of damage or loss to that ship if the assistance isn't provided. Also, the number of people on board and the likelihood of the injury or death of those people on board if that assistance isn't provided. And given that this was a brand new ship on its maiden voyage, it holds full of cargo, with 8 people on board, this compensation could have been tens, if not hundreds of thousands of pounds. And Captain Morton turned down the offer for assistance. Now, it's long been speculated why he would do that. Was it just for the potential cost of the tow? Or, I mean, if he had issued a mayday, that automatically sets off an inquiry. It has to be an inquiry when a mayday is called. And if that independent board in London had reviewed it, in either circumstance, they would have certainly found out that his wife and daughters were on board when they didn't have permission to be. And that could have meant the end of his career. but we don't really know what was going through his head at that time. A little bit later, the Coast Guard contacted Captain Morton and said, have you been in touch with the Nord Holland? Have you spoken to them? And he dismissively said yes, but all they're interested in is money. Now, at the moment, at that time, the conditions were fairly benign. Force 5 on the Beaufort scale, which is pretty good. We haven't had Force 5 conditions any time on this cruise so far. But the barometer was dropping very quickly, and the prediction was for a severe storm that night. Now, the Coast Guard rang the coxswain of the Penlee Lifeboat and put them on standby. Now, they were adjusting the famous Mousel Christmas Harbour lights at the time. Now, this is a fundraiser for the RNLI. It's been going on for decades and decades, where the local council pays the RNLI to put up these lights, adjust them, maintain them as necessary. So the coxswain called his men together and told them to go home and get their equipment and let their families know that they might have a job on that night. Now, that storm that night, if you talk to old-timers along the coastline of Cornwall, they'll tell you that that was the most severe storm in the history of Cornwall. Nothing has ever been seen like it before or since, and that data is backed up by the Met Office in England. This was Force 12 on the Beaufort scale, which is the highest level you can possibly go to. Winds more than 120 kilometres an hour and gusting much, much higher than that. Swells coming across the ocean 60 feet high or 18 metres high. The official definition of Force 12 is exceptionally high waves. The air is filled with foam and spray. Sea is completely white with driving spray. Visibility very seriously affected. Devastation. Now, at 1941, Captain Morton contacted the Coast Guard and informed them that they'd found water in the fuel tanks and there was probably no possibility of getting the engines restarted again. So the Coast Guard contacted the Royal Navy and the Sea King helicopter, Rescue 80, was launched under the command of Lieutenant Commander Russell Smith of the United States Navy, who was on exchange to the Royal Navy at that time. They reached the Union Star, they got out there. Commander Smith said that he could see the lights of the Nord Holland, the rescue tug, the salvage tug standing by, and he heard a radio call between the Nord Holland and the Union Star, with the Nord Holland saying, "This is your last chance. Do you want to tow or not? We're not staying out any longer in these conditions." And once again, Captain Morton turned down the offer for that assistance, for that tow. Now, Commander Smith hovered above the Union Star for over an hour, communicating with Captain Morton. Captain Morton his engineer was trying to change the filters to try and see whether they could get the engine started again. But all this time, they were communicating with each other, and Commander Smith was saying, "What do you want us to do? What do you want us to do?" And then eventually he said, "You've got us out here. What do you want us to do?" And eventually Captain Morton agreed to allow people to be evacuated from the ship. Now, at this time, by now, they're only 2.5 miles off the coast, and the following conversation took place.
How many people do you plan on transferring? One woman and 2 children, over. Sorry, say again. One woman and 2 children, over. Sorry, say again. One woman and 2 children. The crew will remain aboard until the last, over. Yeah, confirm 1 woman and 2 children. Yes, that's correct.
So you might hear the surprise in Commander Smith's voice, because this was the very first time that anyone had mentioned that there was women and children aboard the ship. Captain Morton had told the Coast Guard there was 8 people, but he hadn't mentioned his wife and daughters. Now, you can read the standard operating procedures or the operation manuals of any rescue organisation or first responder organisation anywhere in the world, and they all say exactly the same thing, that all lives are created equal. But out there in the real world, and I can tell you from experience that when women and children are involved in a rescue, the rescuers take on another level of responsibility. And that's what happened on this night. Now, I want you to try and imagine, I don't know if any of you have been in a helicopter before, especially a military helicopter. They're not the most stable things in the world at the best of times, and this wasn't the best of times. This is as bad as it can get. Hurricane conditions. Now, just try and imagine the conditions in the cockpit that night. The noise, for example. You had the engines revving up to almost maximum because they had to face into the wind the whole time. They had to face into the teeth of the storm. If they got off centre, it was the danger of flipping the helicopter and there being another disaster. So we had to rev up into the wind to high revs, so you had the noise of the engines, but you also had the noise of the rotors and the windscreen wipers going full tilt. But then you had all that rain that was smashing against the metal sides of the helicopter and against the windscreen as well. And the noise of that wind outside, quite incredible. The concentration levels would have had to be absolutely enormous. Now, it wasn't just the water that was the problem. It was mostly the salt spray whipped up by those winds. So those windscreen wipers weren't being very effective at all. The windows at the front of the helicopter were basically covered in salt, and visibility out there was very poor. Commander Smith had observation windows down near his feet, but those were also very largely obscured by this salt spray. One of the Royal Navy crew members had to lean his head and shoulders out the side of the helicopter in hurricane conditions to be the eyes of the helicopter and give Commander Smith directions and instructions on what he should do. Now, the helicopter had a very powerful searchlight which was able to illuminate the ship, and the Union Star was able to get their generator started for some time, and they had their deck lights on. So the ship itself was very well illuminated, but you can imagine that for everything else, for miles and miles around, was absolutely inky black. You couldn't see a thing. So you couldn't see those 60-foot swells as they came across the ocean and suddenly lifted that ship up towards the helicopter that was hovering just above it. That crew member leaning out the side had to yell several times, climb, climb, emergency climb, because they were in danger of hitting the superstructure of the ship as it rose up. Commander Smith told us that on one occasion he yanked back on the yoke so hard he cracked the perspex cover that was protecting the instrument panel. It was very, very dangerous. In the tail rotor of down near the tail of the helicopter, they have sensors there, and these sensors are proximity alarms, collision alarms, and they were going off. The tail rotor got so close to the superstructure of the ship. And then you've got the man dangling from a wire below, trying to reach the deck of the ship. Now, he is swinging wildly in these huge winds. He said that on an occasion, he saw himself swinging back towards the ship as the ship rose. He thought he was going to be smashed against the side of this steel ship, but luckily Commander Smith was able to climb the helicopter just in time. He tucked his legs up and just cleared the handrail of the ship. On another occasion, he said he looked down and he could see this ship rising up towards him. He thought his legs were going to be crushed, but once again, Commander Smith was able to raise the helicopter just in time. He said that he got so close to the wheelhouse of the Union Star that he, on one occasion, was able to look down and he could see two people standing outside the wheelhouse. Because of the lighting, he could only see them from the waist down. But he said one of them was obviously a young girl and she was wearing bright red shoes. And that's his enduring memory of that night. Now, after several attempts, it became clear that there was no way to be able to get a man down onto the deck of that ship. And Commander Smith had to radio up saying that they would have to abandon their rescue attempt, and the Penlee Lifeboat was activated. Now, the crew, the volunteers assembled under the command of their coxswain, Trevelyan Richards. Now, Richards was already a legend amongst the people of Cornwall and amongst the RNLI in general for some of the other rescues that he had carried out through an amazing career that he had had. He had 12 volunteers, 9 men for the boat party and 3 volunteers as part of the launching crew. But there was 2 men, father and son, Nigel and Neil Brockman, who were volunteers for the boat crew. Because of the conditions, Richards went to them and said, it's too dangerous. I will not take 2 members of the same family out on a night like that. And at the age of 18, young Neil Brockman had to stay behind. The boat was launched at 12 minutes past 8 that night. And when I say launched, the way it was launched back in those days, the boat would be housed in that shed over there on the left-hand side, and then they'd pull the men would get on board, the engines would start, they'd pull a lever, and the boat would slide down that ramp and be away on its way. But that photo was obviously taken in pristine conditions, and that night was anything but pristine. Absolutely pitch black, strong winds and waves crashing onto up to where those red doors are there. The rescue crew had to wait several agonising minutes for the right moment to launch this boat. If they'd launched it a few seconds too early or a few seconds too late, those waves would have just picked up the boat and smashed it onto the rocks that you can see behind the shed there. But eventually it was launched. And the boat was named the Solomon Brown. It is just a 14-metre or 47-foot boat. It is a wooden boat. It has a top speed of 9 knots, which is about half the speed that we're doing right now. And it reached the Union Star half an hour after it was launched. But by this time, the Union Star had come in closer to the coast, and as well as those swells, they also had to contend with severe breaking waves as well. Now, the Union Star had deployed its anchor by this stage to try and hold it in position, but it was having little effect. The anchor was dragging, and in fact it got in the way a lot of the time. Rescue 80 with Commander Smith stayed on location. They provided overwatch using their spotlight to illuminate the scene as well, and they were the people that were able to provide most of the information later on. They said that the Solomon Brown came up along the side of the ship. They said that they could see the crew members of the Solomon Brown out on the deck trying to grab hold of the handrails of the Solomon Brown. But because the ship was lurching so much, they couldn't hold on and they broke away. But the little wooden lifeboat, kept on going back time and time again. He said that on one occasion he could see the men put ropes around those handrails and try them hold themselves into position. And he saw them indicating to the wheelhouse, come out, come out. But no one ever did. Now, you can probably imagine the conditions in that wheelhouse at that time. They must have been absolutely terrified, but they probably all of them, especially the women and children, were probably extremely seasick at the time as well. So, excuse me, probably accounts for the fact that they didn't come out. Smith reported that they were only 300 yards from the coast. Excuse me. But they kept on going back, and by this time there was rocks that they had to contend with as well. They had to try and drive around those rocks. And every time they went back, they were smashed up against the side, the steel hull of that ship. On one occasion, a huge wave picked up the Solomon Brown and deposited it on the foredeck of the Union Star. Now, this would have been, once again, absolutely terrifying for everyone involved. But after a few seconds, the Union Star rolled and the lifeboat slid back into the water. Now, it's believed at this time that the propeller of the Solomon Brown was damaged, because when it was recovered, there was one of the blades had a severe bend in it, and there was a corresponding mark on the deck of the Union Star. So this would have severely impacted the speed of the Solomon Brown, the manoeuvrability, and also the stability, which makes what happened next even more incredible, because they kept on going back. Commander Smith reported to them, "You're only 10 minutes from the coast," and he saw the little lifeboat come up beside them, get to the leeward side, avoiding rocks and avoiding that anchor chain, get to the lee side, and eventually people ran out of the wheelhouse dressed in bright yellow life jackets. They don't know how many, but they saw it. The people in the helicopter saw them jumping down towards the lifeboat. Now, by this time, then the lifeboat manoeuvred around and it looked like it was heading back out to sea. Commander Smith assumed that the rescue attempt was over. They were having huge problems in the helicopter at that time. They still had to keep their nose pointed directly into the wind, and they were using the searchlight to illuminate the scene. But they had backed up so much that those tail rotors were now very, very close to the cliffs behind them. Their proximity collision alarms from the tail rotors were going off again, adding to the noise in the cockpit. But they had even bigger problems than that, because that salt spray had clogged up the engine air intake filters. And so the engines were now overheating. The gauges were well and truly into the red. And Commander Smith had to say to the Coast Guard, "We can't stay here any longer, we're returning to base." Now they headed back towards their base. They only went for about 30 seconds before they heard the Solomon Brown call up again, saying that they were going back for one more try. And then he heard the following message.
Farmers Coast Guard, Farmers Coast Guard, this is a Penlee Lifeboat. Penlee Boat calling Farmers Coast Guard. Penlee Lifeboat, Farmers Coast Guard, go. We got 4 men off, hang on, we got 4 off at the moment. Male and female. There's 2 left on board at the time.
So they got 4 off, male and female. We don't know what ratio of male and female, but there's 2 left on board. Now, we knew there was 8 people on board. 4 and 2 equals 6. Where are the other 2? So you'll probably hear the inquiry, the questioning in the voice of the Coast Guard operator.
Penlee Lifeboat, Farmers Coast Guard, I understand you have 4 off, and you say there's 2 left on board, over? Penlee Lifeboat, Farmers Coast Guard, over.
So he'd make that call again and again. But he didn't receive reply, and he never would. When dawn broke the next day, the upturned hull of the Union Star was found smashed on the rocks of the coast of Cornwall. The almost brand new propeller gleaming indecently in the weak English sunshine. The largest part of the Solomon Brown that was ever found wasn't much bigger than this podium. All 16 people perished, 8 from the Union Star, 8 from the Solomon Brown. Over the next few days, there was a huge search operation to try and find the victims. In total, only 8 were ever found, 4 from the Solomon Brown, 4 from the Union Star. And on Christmas Eve, the tiny, heartbroken village of Mousel buried 2 of their heroes, and on Boxing Day, they buried the other 2. The Commander Smith and Rescue 80 heard these calls going unanswered as they made their way back to their base. They suspected the worst. Once they landed, even though the engines hadn't cooled down, they grabbed hoses and they washed out those engine air take filters, and then they topped up with fuel and they went back to the scene. It had only taken them 15 minutes to get back to their base with that wind behind them, but it took them more than 50 minutes to get back onto the scene with the wind against them. That's how severe the winds were at that time. They searched all through the night, but didn't see anything. There was an inquiry into what happened with this disaster, and at that inquiry, Commander Smith gave evidence, and he said that the actions of the lifeboat crew were the greatest act of courage that I've ever seen or am ever likely to see. There has been some good to come out of all this, and it's called the legacy of the Solomon Brown. the Coast Guard is no longer passive. They can issue a mayday on behalf of a vessel, and they can compel the skipper or the master of that vessel to either take a tow or to abandon ship. And it's said that the legacy of the Solomon Brown has saved dozens, if not hundreds of people over the last 40 years. Young Neil Brockman, who wasn't allowed to go out that night, 10 years after the tragedy, he was made the coxswain of the Penlee Lifeboat crew, the youngest coxswain in the history of the RNLI. 2 years ago, in our role as ambassadors for the Australian Volunteer Coast Guard, Lee and I were tasked to go to Cornwall and present a burgee or a flag to the crew of the Penlee Lifeboat as a mark of respect, how much respect and admiration we have for them and those who have gone before them. It was a great morning. They had the whole current Penlee Lifeboat crew there. They had a lot of their fundraising volunteers there as well. They had one man there who had been part of the launching party that night, and very special, they had some of the families of the men who lost their lives that night there as well. This is Patch Harvey. He is the current coxswain of the Penlee Lifeboat. He's been served in that capacity for 17 years and had a magnificent 32-year career with the lifeboat so far. Last year, he was awarded a bravery medal for a rescue that he and his crew carried out less than a week before this photo was taken. So it was great timing. We had gone along there with quite a deal of trepidation. We knew that they knew that I did a presentation about the disaster, but we didn't know how they felt about that. So we were very relieved that during his speech, Patch said how grateful they were that we were doing this talk, keeping the memory of their heroes alive. And then he really surprised us. He turned around and he presented us with these t-shirts. And he inducted us in as honorary members of the Penlee Lifeboat crew, which is something that we will always be very, very proud of. While we were there, that morning we got to have a play with the lifeboat, the new lifeboat. We got to talk to the people there, including the family members there. They told us how hard it was living in a tiny village where around every corner was another memory. They said that every time they had a conversation with people for years after the disaster, they could see in their eyes that they were thinking about it, so it was tough. I asked them about how they felt. I had to know, how do you feel about the fact that they kept on going back, including that last time? And they said that none of those men would have considered for a second not going back when there was people that needed their help. It was just their nature. They asked us about the talk that I did, and I told them that it was only a short 20-minute talk, but I didn't do it very often because of the effect it had on me. Their concern is as they grow older and they pass on, the sacrifice that their men made would be forgotten. So they made me promise that no matter how hard this was, I'd continue to tell the story. And as I said before, that's a promise I fully intend to maintain and keep. While we were there, we also got to catch up with young Neil Brockman. Lovely guy, fantastic personality. He's got a very broad Cornish accent. He really should come with subtitles so you can understand him a bit better. But we had a couple of drinks together, and he told us stories about his old crew members, but especially his dad. He said his dad, and you can probably see by this photo, his dad was one of those men that would light up a room as soon as he walked in. Everyone in the village loved him. He was one of those people that was the first to offer help if anyone needed that help. Neil's especially proud of his dad because when his dad's body was found, his arms were still wrapped around the youngest girl, trying to protect her to the very edge. As I said, I didn't do this talk very often at all, but back in 2019, we were aboard the Viking Sea. And for some reason, I decided to do this talk about unknown heroes. There was no reason that I had to do it. I just thought that I should do it. When I finished, a man came up to the front of the stage here and introduced himself. And his name was Dr. Richard Smith. He was the older brother of Russell Smith, the helicopter pilot. Russell had been on board for 10 days. It was the first lecture he'd been to at that time. He had no idea that his brother was going to feature in the story. So he put me in contact with Russell. We swapped emails for a while, then phone calls. He gave me a lot of information about the conditions that night, especially in the cockpit. And he and his wife Sue invited Lee and I to visit them at their home in Eugene, Oregon. And we planned to do that in April of 2020, but because of COVID, we couldn't go. But thanks to them and thanks to Viking, in January last year, we got to catch up with them in San Francisco, and we stayed with them for 4 days there. Had a fantastic time. They're wonderful people. They showed us all the sights of San Francisco, Fisherman's Wharf, and we rode on the trolley cars, the cable car. We walked across the Golden Gate Bridge. They led us astray with Irish coffees, and we enjoyed it so much we let them do it again. But there was a couple of nights there where we stayed up to the wee small hours of the morning talking about what had happened. There was lots of tears. I've read the official report into what happened that night several times. It goes out of its way to praise the valour, the skill and the persistence of Commander Smith and the crew of Rescue 80. It says that they went far beyond what any reasonable person would have expected them to do, and that given the conditions that night, there was absolutely nothing else that they could have done. Now, Russ knows that in his head, but he told us that there hasn't been many days since December 1981 where he hasn't thought to himself, was there something else I could have said or done that might have altered the outcome? And of course, there's not. But unfortunately, Russ really hasn't ever forgiven himself for surviving when so many others didn't that night. We were on Viking Sea 6 weeks ago, crossing the Atlantic from Barcelona down to Puerto Rico, and we had some very special guests on board. Russell and Richard and their wives Sue and Wanda joined us. This was the first Viking cruise that Russell had ever done. It was the first time that he'd heard me present this talk. They sat in the front row down here. Russell said that before the talk that he was really concerned that he would people might judge him harshly for what happened that night. But when I acknowledged his presence and introduced him, he received an incredible ovation from the audience that were here, and he said that it was very humbling for him, and he felt like a huge burden had been lifted off his shoulders. While we were in San Francisco, he told us that he talked more about what happened that night during the 4 days we were together there than he had in the previous 40 years. And that the family now had a much better understanding, and that he felt it was a cathartic experience for him as well. He and Sue have been back to Cornwall on a few occasions for anniversaries of the event, and he said that he always felt very welcome there, but not always very comfortable. He didn't really know how the families felt about him. We'd just been with the families 3 weeks before. We knew exactly how they felt about him. They hold him in the highest regard. They know there was absolutely nothing else he could have done that night, but more important than that, he was the last person to see their men alive, and he was the one that was able to tell them what happened that night, and they'll always be incredibly grateful to him for that. Russ loved his Viking experience. He's booked 2 more cruises, and hopefully we get to spend some more sailing time with them again. This is a very conflicting and presentation for me. On one hand, it's obviously a tragic story that severely impacted the lives of people that we've come to know and like and respect very, very much. It is so emotionally draining, and I absolutely dread having to get up here and go through this. But on the other hand, and the way I not like to perceive it now, is that this is an inspiring and uplifting story because it shows that there's people, just ordinary men and women, and they're all over the world, who are prepared to put themselves in harm's way and help complete strangers in their hour of greatest need. And I feel absolutely privileged to be able to come up here and tell you about just a few of them. A few years, the rusted carcass of the Union Star still scars the coastline of Cornwall to this day. And on the 19th of December, right now, back in England, between the hours of 8 p.m. and 10 p.m, the Mousel Christmas Harbour lights are extinguished as an ongoing tribute to the heroes of the Solomon Brown. It's a very simple but extremely moving ceremony.